All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Tiger Talk presentation featuring some of the great people in our class of 79. I'm Edward Goldstein and just thrilled to be back at CC and with my family. You'll hear our two little boys on occasion here, and it's just fun because we're going to have a great program for you. Before I get started, I wanted to acknowledge, first of all, are there any faculty members of our class of 79 here or staff members? Diane, you are? Yeah. Diane Benninghalf, our great alumni director, who was just, I had so many good years working with you on alumni matters. It was terrific. Are there any class of 69 people here? I see Bob Lee, first of all. Bob, you need to acknowledge yourself. How are you?
I'm retired.
Ah, great. Am I seeing anybody? Okay. So, the class of 79, I'm going to give you a little perspective about us. So, 44 years ago, we arrived here with great anticipation and expectations for what a terrific liberal arts education would be. And we were armed with the latest in high-speed information technology, which was our spiral notebooks and our portable typewriters. For us, instant messaging was the once a week lining up in our dorm rooms to use the phone, to call home to ask for a care package. And social media was going to beam us for dinner and rushing home to tell people in our dorms what was on the menu. And despite the deficiencies of our technology and how primitive it was, we did share some things in common with the CC students of today. And that is the sense of a liberal arts intellectual adventure, which was very strong then. You know, we had ambitions of being a national liberal arts institution of distinction back then, and I think we were there. And now, and when you look at our class, we came from all the cities and states of America, farm towns like Terry Swenson. Where's Terry right now? There you are. Sorry. There's Terry. And we did have a few international students, but now it really is an international institution, and that's all for the better. Our five speakers today represent the best of the liberal arts, and they're all fields: the natural, social, and humanities, and they also represent kind of something that is ingrained in the CC spirit, and that is service to others. And you're going to see that sense of community, of building communities. All five speakers really have connections to that, and really helping for causes greater than one's own self-interest. And it is just terrific to have people of that caliber here speaking. And there are other class members I look around and see. I wanted to acknowledge a couple. Jim Collins, our class president. Where are you, Jim? There you go. He brought our class to a safe landing in 79, and if you've ever flown U.S. Airways, he's brought you to many safe landings as your pilot. So it's good to see Jim here. And sitting next to him, fellow Arvado High School graduate, Dr. Michael Hunt. He is one of our class members who's a Dr. Squared. He is an honorary degree recipient from our college for the tremendous work Mike did on planning for medical emergencies that are of national significance, and we've all been through that, haven't we? And Mike, congratulations on your imminent retirement. That's good for you. So we'll get to our speakers. I'm going to start with Suzanne Brister. We all had a long and winding road. So hers was very long and winding. And we had a winding road coming here too, and we'll get into that about our speakers. But Suzanne started as an economics major, so we'll get her up here and we'll find out, how does an economics major wind up doing all this great work in the medical field? So Suzanne, you're up.
Good afternoon. Now let's see if I can make this work.
Yes, very good. All right, so I did graduate 40 years ago as an economics major and really did not feel like going to get a doctorate in order to continue that. So I went into what was easiest at the time, which was information technology, and worked there for 17 years. But got a little bit bored with that, wanted more human interaction, wanted to do something that meant a little more than making sure that your gas bill was correct. And one of the things I have to say that was really valuable at CC is they taught me how to learn and instilled this lifelong love of learning. And that's what really paved the way for me to go back to med school at age 39. I was the third, there were two people older than me in med school at that point in time. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about what to expect in the next 10 years before our 50th reunion. When I told my family this, there was dead silence at the table. And then my older brother said, "God, what a bummer." So they kind of have a point, okay? Because we are entering prime time for cancer. As you can see up here, all of the big cancers, they usually get diagnosed in the 60s. And unfortunately, a lot of us have this opinion that we don't have a family history, we don't have the risk. Well, most cancers, as you can see at the bottom, it's less than a 5 to 10% chance, or less than 5 to 10% of the people are familial. The rest are all comers, you and I out there. And unfortunately, at our age, it's a little too late to prevent. So what you have to do at this point is try to detect it early and treat it early. So you can see all of the different things. You've been told to do these things. Get a colonoscopy. You don't want to get it. Do be very careful when you read things about you don't need to do things. You know, your mammogram, you can do it every 2 to 5 years, if at all. Take a look at who's telling you that. Sometimes those committees do not have experts in that field. Sometimes they're looking at it from an economic standpoint. It makes more financial sense to detect only every 5 years. But when you're the person getting the breast or the prostate cancer, it may make a lot different sense than what they're seeing. So I do recommend you consider those because treatment of cancer has been revolutionized. When I started med school, lung cancer, it was pretty much a death sentence. Now our 5-year prognosis is amazing. But if you can catch it early, let's see if I can make that thing work. This low-dose CT scan, if you smoked for more than 30 pack years, you should be getting that every year. The treatments really are quite good. The big movement that's really making a difference is the genetics. So regardless what type of cancer you get, they will biopsy it to determine what the genetics are, and that can tailor the treatment to your particular cancer. One problem with that. Oops, wrong buttons. Yeah, she can be taught. Okay. Things that are brand new treatments, Medicare may not cover them yet. So that's something to be aware of because in a few years we're going to be on Medicare. So that's something you'll want to be very cautious of at that point in time. One real quick thing, I won't spend much time here. We are in that prime age group that was exposed to hepatitis B and C. It didn't have to do just with drugs, okay? It was sexually transmitted. Get tested, get treated. The treatments are much better now. But this is what's looming in the next 3 years for most of you. Medicare, it can be very complex. So I've listed up there the different parts. A and B. A is your inpatient, B is your outpatient. D is actually, oops, I keep hitting the wrong button. D is actually optional. It's drug coverage. Be very cautious about not electing it because if you choose it later, say you're healthy now, you don't have any medicines, if you choose it later, you're going to pay a penalty every month for the rest of your life. So it's quite complicated and be very careful. It is similar to many of the insurance policies you probably have today, except for the donut hole. Do make sure that you have several thousand put aside in case you spend enough on your drugs, because at a certain point, your copays go massively up and your drug company does not pay as much until you hit $5,000 out of pocket. So be very cautious of that. Medicare C is actually Medicare Advantage. Politically, there's some questions as to whether that may be going away, but it's extremely popular right now because it bundles A, B, and D often together. They're actually HMOs, but they're way better than the HMOs when we got out of school. They are based on what is your healthcare risk, and they will drive you crazy with a number of questions about: have you fallen? Have you lost control of your bladder? Have you been depressed? Are you depressed that you lost control of your bladder and fell? But they have much lower copays, and they often give you things like gym memberships, vision and hearing care, which are not covered under Medicare. Medicare, the devil is in the details. It's true. It is so complicated that at this point, I really feel like you should gather all your medical information and meet with an independent person, an independent agent. Make sure they are truly independent, because it can make such a difference in choosing the plan that is right for you. One thing to be very aware of is that Medicare is based on medical necessity. And that means your cosmetic condition, sexual dysfunction, the Saxenda for weight loss, those things are not covered. And you can appeal until you're blue in the face. They are not covered by Medicare and will not be at this point. Also, if your doctor is using things that have some medical science behind them but aren't what we call compendia supported, you will not get them paid for. No Lyrica for back pain. Sometimes it's more serious than that. It may be that your prostate cancer has the BRCA breast cancer mutation. So your oncologist may want to target that with one of the breast cancer drugs. If there's not the appropriate literature support for that, it will not be covered. So this is where it gets very complicated. And frankly, most of the physicians don't know this stuff. It's pretty tricky. So one last word on this. Going back to our days, Mick Jagger was right. You can't always get what you want, but if you try, you'll get what you need. People are always asking me, what am I worried about? These are the things I'm worried about in the next 10 years, and that is the cost of drugs. These are monthly costs up there. Some of them are I can see it. That AML is a type of leukemia that's very hard to treat. But that chenodiol, there's an alternative that's about $50 a month. Maybe not quite as effective, but how can the taxpayer support this? We can't. HP Acthar is the one that really infuriates me. This is, it's used instead of steroids. It's got some really great benefits in certain conditions. Manufactured by Sanofi in 2001 for $40 a month. It's now almost $39,000 by, well, I just won't say what I think about that. So on the horizon, some really amazing things, possible cures, not treatments, cures for things like hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, all at a cost. So that's going to be a big issue we'll need to be working on. As you can see, medicine's getting very complicated. CC gave you the ability to research and read. You need to educate yourself on these things. Be proactive about your health. If it's overwhelming and you are having trouble being your own advocate, get an advocate. Medicine is so complicated these days, it's really important to do that for proper care. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was a tremendous start to these talks. I apologize. Deborah Johns, she is the organizer for these Tiger Talks. She did such a great job. Yeah. Susan, when you gave your great presentation, I couldn't help but think of our classmate, Marianne Vaughn, who had ovarian. We really miss her. Okay, so we will move on. Our second speaker, Ellen Burton, was a vice president of our senior class. And yeah, absolutely.
Still getting dressed here. There's a few memories, actually. I can remember getting ready for a Kappa Theta formal, and I hadn't had my dress yet, so I'm literally sitting on the sewing machine with this red silk dress going through as Len Bose is waiting for me to finish. True story. So I asked Nancy if our Airbnb had a sewing machine, and she said no.
Ellen, you can't follow that in any reasonable way. What I will say is that last year was just this incredible year where extremely talented people put their hat in the ring for the first time to run for public office, and Ellen was one of them, and now she's sitting on the city council of Camas, Washington.
I
Ellen,
am.
we are proud of you.
Thank you. All right. I have no slides because I am protesting 38 years in global business. So no slide whipping today. Just wanted to make that clear for those of you still that live that life. Wow. It's good to be back in Sea Springs. Back at Colorado College, the idyllic liberal arts school nestled at the foot of Pikes Peak. Let's first thank the reunion committee that's worked so hard to put this together in a rather thankless task. And then for Susan for putting some kind of like, oh gosh, this is coming in our lives. A little bit of trivia, a little known fact. Susan and I began our CC experience on 4 North of the dorm now called South. I bet there's a number of others of you that were in maybe the bunk beds down on the first layer, or the 3rd floor where you dared with your life to walk down 3 South. How many people started in that same dorm? Whoa. To us. How about Matthias, Bemis? There we go. A great showing here today. Susan and I, our rooms were actually at the far end of the hall, a 50-yard dash from that shared, mind you, black rotary telephone. You remember those? Yeah. As Ed mentioned, I'm Ellen Burton, class of 79. And since in my next act, I'm a politician, I have to say my names 3 times. That's 1, 2 more to go. Here today, I'm going to talk about my next steps, diving into dynamic local politics. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share my inspiration, how CC experience prepared me, and how you too can dive in to dynamic local politics. Why? Why in the world did I trade my life of leisure, forays to foreign lands, and my pursuit of perpetual powder with my best ski friend here for boundless bureaucracy, falling funding, and blue-green algae? What prompted me to serve? Well, it was a combination of inspiration, emotion, and that driver of creativity, boredom. First, I was inspired, as Ed mentioned, by the courageous women that stood up to run for public office. We need more women and people of color in public service. It's 2019, and most leaders' positions of leadership, they aren't people that look like us. I walked into my first planning commission meeting in my small town of Camas, Washington, population 23,483, located on the banks of the mighty Columbia River across from Portland, Oregon, the home of Portlandia. And I was astounded to see no diversity. 130-something. They were all old. 60-something. Second, I was triggered emotionally. I was sitting in traffic, snaking along the shoreline, late for my 4th Skype call of the hour, and I thought, what is going on with this traffic? Someone has to fix this. Wait a minute. I went to CC. Maybe I need to fix this. Has anyone else ever had that thought, or am I like the only weird one here? Yeah, I figured as much. It's kind of me. I'm always an anomaly. And third, I was bored, that driver of creativity. I had retired 4 months earlier, trained very hard and to become a master gardener, volunteer, and I needed more. I mean, how many times can you respond to that home gardener showing you the baggie of cracked dead leaf saying, what's wrong with my plant? Well, being a CC semi-science major, I could say, animal, vegetable, mineral? Are you sure that's a plant? Well, after a lot of research, I realized I was still relevant. My global experience applicable, my perspective strategic, and my execution and communication skills well honed. Unless you too studied with Alex Varga, it's not likely you know how to communicate with a leafhopper. But it is proven if you can do this, you can communicate with anybody, anywhere. Just ask those Chinese engineers. Lastly, public service is a family value. It's in my DNA. From my great-grandfather, head of the Minneapolis YMCA, to my mother, the first woman on the planning commission for the county in which Seattle sits. The men thought she was there to serve coffee, and many other stories. Public service is a family value. Let's take it up a level. As one of my professors sitting right here in the room used to say, public service is a personal responsibility when living in a democracy. A personal responsibility. A vacancy came up in the city council, and I had my choice. Go to shred boot camp, taught by the D1 former soccer player, or go get interviewed by 8 people, 6 questions in 10 minutes. I chose the interview. And there I am. I diving in to dynamic local politics. I'm going in. Let's talk about what I've learned and how CC prepared me for this dynamic environment. 3 key learnings. Jurisdiction is limited. Time horizon is long, and funding is tight. And one secret I'm going to share today. Jurisdiction is limited. Cities serve a wide variety of services at a very narrow scope. Infrastructure, safety, parks, to name a few. We don't run schools, we don't pass state laws, yet this continuously confuses our citizens. We get a wide range of requests from the heavily armed alt-right group, yet very respective prayer boys requesting sanctuary city status. Now I'll tell you, our high school intern, her eyes were this big counting the number of concealed weapons in that group, and they were very respectful. To the beekeepers, the local beekeepers buzzing about bee preservation. The time horizon, the jurisdiction is limited. Second, the time horizon is long. My town, my little town, studied the feasibility of building a recreation center for almost 30 years. That was from before the turn of the century. We have now put it on the ballot. Meanwhile, the population of the town has increased 4 times. Most don't care about the history and don't care to learn, as evidenced by the social media attacks. And third, funding is tight. 1% increase in local property taxes a year is about the equivalent of 1 deputy firefighter in a population that's growing very fast. And restricted, we can't shift money from budget to budget. If we get a grant to build a swing set, we cannot use it to fill a pothole, no matter how many appear near Portland, Oregon. And now for the secret. For the secret, my role as a memory keeper. When the council decided to close the beloved yet leaky 63-year-old cement pool, remember the kind with the green algae in the locker rooms? $100,000 a year for 10 weeks of operation, $3.3 million to upgrade, the citizens were furious. They're still furious. Children held protests. Voters signed petitions. Neighbors built memorials. By closing the pool, we had single-handedly destroyed the childhood of children, past, present, and future. I truly did not know this was one of my responsibilities. We had violated our role as a memory keeper, diving in to dynamic local politics. Now, how does my CC experience come in when navigating this dynamic world? First, of course, the block plan. Is that obvious or not? Dive deep and learn fast. In 3.5 weeks, we can learn anything. This is a true skill. Organic chemistry, European history before 1850, European history since 1815. We crammed it in. Second, interdisciplinary approach. Through our broad liberal arts education, team teaching, and interdisciplinary learning, we understand linkages between decisions and the effect on the total system. Bio majors studied with music majors. Math majors studied with history majors. This cross-fertilization means we have a different perspective from my engineering friends that were told how to solve one problem. We approach things in a very different way. And third, the learning community. The constant daily interaction between professors and students to challenge us to continuously learn from each other, not just from formal sources. This is very different than most. We have a different approach to opportunities, problems, and life. Now, why you too can dive in to dynamic local politics. 40 years ago, we immersed ourselves in an extraordinary learning experience. We sat around the campfire with students and professors with different views, values, and beliefs. We listened and we learned. We asked insightful questions and drew our own fact-based conclusions, which we effectively communicated. We dove headfirst into new subjects, new cultures abroad, or activities, and discovered interests, talents that we didn't know existed. Now, as we enter the final third of our lives, it's time to give back. There's a recent Atlantic article that said intellectual capacity has started to decline, and so has ego. We no longer have to run it all anymore. Many of us have the means, the time, and the experiences organizations crave and can use. The time is now. I challenge each and every one of us in this room to dive in and become involved. Where we're passionate, humanitarian, political, environmental. Share your talent, share your energy, share your experience to make a difference. That's what we were trained to do. Public service is our personal responsibility when living in a democracy. Now the secret is out. You know what inspired me. You know how our CC experience prepared us, and how you too can take your next step diving in to dynamic local politics. I'm Ellen Burton, public servant, diving in to dynamic local politics. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, Ellen, when Senator Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell retire, we know who the next...
Well, so story there.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so many years ago in the 70s, my dad was the chair of the Shoreline School District School Board. He held that position for many years. And Patty Murray at the time was president of the Lake Forest Park Elementary PTA. And he tells how Patty would come in her REI Gore-Tex. It came in one color that time, it was green. Her tennis shoes and her jeans, sitting in the back, and would timidly ask a question of the school board. And she says, Patty, says my dad, he just turned 90 Tuesday, you need to sit in front. And this is how you need to ask the questions. And this is how you need to build the alliances. And this is how you need to prioritize to get work done. Last year, I was working on a campaign for a very talented congressional candidate, and I met Patty Murray. And I said, Patty Murray, I'm Ellen Burton. You don't know me, but you know my dad. And she said, Paul Burton, how is he? He was my mentor so many years ago. And I'm like, holy shit, the stories were true.
All right. So while Ellen changes mics with Mike, want to mention that Mr. Ibarra is also was also very active while at CC and was the vice president of the CCCA. And I think you were one of the chief organizers of the Fun Fly Day event. Is that correct? Yeah.
No comment.
Okay. But he's had an incredible career in business and with the foundation world. And whereas Ellen is making her mark on one community, and I hope many more communities, Mike certainly is involved with kind of reorganizing the way we think about the involvement of business in building strong communities. So, Mike, up to you.
All right, thank you. Am I on here? Can you hear me? You know, it's interesting. So as I was listening to the first two speeches, I had put together some stuff that I wanted to talk about relative to the context of when we all were at school, but you all covered it for the most part. A couple of things I remember, though, from when we all started. As I recall, some 60-some-odd% of us came here with a declared expectation of either going on to medical school or law school. As I recall, I think that was correct. And in fact, when you kind of look at this group of people, and probably many of you in the audience, I think a lot of that happened. For me, not so much. It was a little bit different story. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about kind of a very circuitous route to where I found myself really starting around 2007, 2009. And it started with this notion of coming into CC and fully expecting to go to medical school from there. For a whole lot of reasons, I realized, a couple of years into it, wasn't for me. It just really wasn't what I wanted to do. But I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I did complete my biology degree, and hopefully know Alex Varga, God bless her, she tried her best. But the reality is it just wasn't my cup of tea. But I did realize sometime later that there were a couple things I did learn that became instrumental to everything that I've done since then. Obviously, critical thinking. We all talked about the small classroom environment, the fact that you engaged, talked to each other, and you thought through problems and issues and how to solve those. That became instrumental. The other thing that didn't occur to me really until pretty recently is in biology or in any science, you think in terms of systems. So every system is connected to another system, and everything sort of has to connect to make to work. So if you're talking about disease, you're talking about other things. If one thing works and others don't, you're broken. So after I left CC, I spent roughly 30 years or so just in a variety of business positions, actually doing things well suited after a biology degree. I was doing large-scale investment management. I actually managed a $10 billion fund. How the hell that happened, I still don't quite know. And I was actually doing kind of complex real estate systems, large buildings, that kind of thing. But in 2007 and 2009, a couple of interesting things happened. 2009, our 30-year anniversary, I took my daughter to Wesleyan University. That's where she chose to go. And Michael Roth, who's the president of Wesleyan, started the parent orientation by looking at everybody and going, the professors hate it when I say this, but you know what? The best learning occurs outside of the classroom. And it struck me at that moment, it's like, I always kind of thought some of that, but actually, upon reflection, I think he had it half right. I think the best learning occurs when you take the foundation that we got here and then think about it for the next course of your life and figure out how you merge real, practical day-to-day learning with sort of the classroom structure that you were given. Second thing that happened, interestingly, summer 2007, I joined a real estate fund who took pension fund dollars, hard-earned money that came from blue-collar workers, and invested it in real estate. Now, you recall what happened in 2007 and 8. I'm not responsible, okay? The market crashed. So I spent a year and a half or 2 years watching people look at their retirement systems go up in smoke. And fortunately, in the fund that we were working, all of that came roaring back, but it was a really, really tough time, and it got me very connected to the individuals whose money we represented. The final thing that happened was I found this thing called CityCraft. And CityCraft was kind of a chance introduction between myself and the founder, a guy by the name of John Knott, who is actually teaching a course up at DU as we speak. And he spent 40 years as a mastercraft developer, really looking at the way we build communities and thinking that the real estate was the last thing you thought about. What you needed to think about was the social structure and the environmental structure and the economic structure. And if you built all that first, and then you actually built real estate, you facilitated something really magical. So something funny happened to me at that point in time. I came to realize, you know what? This systems thinking, this broad scale community basis, guess what? If a biology system looks like that, it turns out that communities look kind of like that. Now, this is a real live chart of one of 6 or 7 things we've actually mapped in Denver. This is a mapping of all of the university systems up in the Northern Colorado area, excuse me. So it happens you live in California. And how they connect to the work that we're trying to do. This is one of about 10 of these maps that we've done. Then what we do is we come back and try to figure out how to take all 10 and integrate them into a plan. That is really interesting stuff, enormously difficult. Had I not learned the way I think I learned here, we'd have no chance of doing this. And ironically, John Knott has been doing this for 40 years. So here's what we've learned about this stuff. Obviously, when you look at our communities, the plague of our communities, really, really complex. Lots of things going on. Very, very difficult stuff. And the problem is the way our system has thought is you tackle one thing. So we tackle the housing issue. And if we tackle housing, things will be fixed. Turns out that we have a childcare problem, that we have a health issue, that we have access to food or transportation. And the traditional way of doing things, either through public assistance, aka raise taxes, or private investment, aka tax benefits, we tend to go after those problems. And guess what? Does anybody see massive transformation going on in our economy? It's not going to happen. We continue to sort of invest in a way, although well-meaning, is simply not making a difference. So CityCraft has gone after this a very different way. The first project that was done actually started in the mid-90s, and there's a neighborhood called Noisette in Charleston, South Carolina. It's one of the places where when the military started to contract out of Navy bases, this was an abandoned base. It was the only economic driver in this entire community. John Knott and his team got involved in that, started literally from the ground up looking at everything involved in that community, and a rather remarkable thing happened. Over 10 years, they took the conditions on the left-hand side. These are literally the things that they ran into. Highest crime rate in the city, schools were a mess, people were leaving, aging population, no economic drivers, et cetera. And by organizing that community and figuring out the way the community could serve its own future, that's where it went. So the process went from, in our involvement, went from 2001 to 2013. We actually left in 2013. And now if you go back to this area and see what's going on, it's all because we built the capacity for the community to tackle their own issues. So after that, I actually grabbed John and I said, let's go look for another market. And we did another nationwide search, and we ended up in Sun Valley, not Sun Valley, Idaho. They don't need a lot of help. This is Sun Valley in West Denver. So if you go west of I-25, south of where the Denver Broncos play, there's a whole area there, largely Hispanic neighborhoods, et cetera, in the whole West Denver area. The dominant real estate owner there is the Denver Housing Authority. There are a bunch of other organizations out there. And what we've come to realize, is that, once again, they had all the tools in place and no process. And we came in, did a 3-year study and said, look, there's a different way of going about this. What we need to do is build the social infrastructure. So we're involved in 2 particular efforts right now to do that. The first is a food system. As it turns out, in most of these areas, these are huge food deserts, and that literally means not only is there not a grocery store there, but there's really nothing there. So we took 2 disparate organizations, sort of competing against each other and frankly failing. We got them all together. We now have a compilation. This is some of the representative groups, but we have now a compilation of 30 different organizations teamed together, focused on a single opportunity to sort of recreate a food system. And I would invite any of you who wants to go. On Wednesdays, they have a really remarkable thing. They have a food kitchen. We've developed a free grocery store, and it's different from a food bank in that it really is a grocery store where you can go in and people come in, and you can see how this organization has built all of this and put it together. And this is now just about ready to go out on its own. And so we're going to be tackling some other things. We're involved in 6 different platforms like this right now. And it's kind of nice for me. I grew up in Denver. It's kind of nice for me that it's kind of come home, because this is an area that was ignored my entire childhood. So this is where we're going on this. We've now teamed with a global organization called Blue Marble, a group called Capital Institute, and then another group called Local Code. And we're actually starting to build a kind of global platform of regenerative communities around the world. The interesting thing is that when you go into each of these cities that are doing this on their own, they're doing it from the ground up. They're looking at their entire communities and their systems, and they're building it that way. So if the philanthropic interests or others come in, they're actually ready to receive that. I'm at 9 minutes. Can you imagine that? And the one thing that's really exciting to me, this literally just got published. This is a new textbook that has now captured all of this work from 10 different authors, including John Knott. It's now going to be the basis of a graduate level program, hopefully at Regis University right here in Denver. And John is actually teaching a required course, the graduate real estate program at University of Denver in regenerative development. And it's all based on this work. Our goal out of what we're trying to do right now is to give all of this information away. We're trying to teach as many people as we can how to go out and do this kind of stuff. And as I think back now, the experience I had here and all the things that sort of pressed me to learn and think about more things, this has become the most extraordinary part of my experience, kind of bring it full circle and the kinds of things that we're now doing. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, while the baton changing goes on, passing.
Okay.
The American West, that's part of the Colorado College environment and heritage. And I remember going to the first alumni college at the Baca that Diane organized. What defines the American Southwest, as opposed to the West in general, but did anybody know what defines the American Southwest best? I know Diane knows, so you can't jump in. Lack of water is one of them. It's the presence of the pinyon juniper pine and the extent of its range. Dick Beidelman, I think, was the wisdom behind that. So Suzanne Lyon, our classmate, she is been part of the great tradition of reframing what we understand about our Western experience. And especially important is the fact that when we think about the traditional Western, it was so male-dominated. So it is just wonderful that Suzanne has had such a leadership role in broadening our understanding of our Western horizons. And Suzanne, please tell us about your inspiration and what you did.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you all the organizers for inviting me to be here today. The other day, my son called me a polymath. He's a CC grad too, hence the excellent vocabulary. Of course, I knew what that meant, but I did go to the dictionary to look it up just to be sure. It means a person having a wide range of knowledge or learning. Well, I was flattered, but I didn't really think that that was a very accurate description of me. I think he was just trying to find a nice way to tell me that I have a short attention span, which is probably true, and CC probably deserves some of the blame or perhaps credit for that, right? I mean, you totally immerse yourself in a topic for 3.5 weeks and then move on. To be honest, I chose CC because of the view. I mean, I grew up in Iowa. Lovely people, not much in the way of views. So when I arrived on campus in the fall of 1975, I was super excited. Not just because I could see Pikes Peak out of my window in Slocum 2 South. This was before the addition had been built that now blocks that view. But because of the wide variety of courses that there was to choose from. As an incoming freshman, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I seriously thought that I might be an engineer, or I might be a singer, or I might run political campaigns. However, my first 2 courses freshman year were an introduction to engineering and then chemistry, after which it became very clear that my future would lie in the humanities or social sciences. Within those 2 disciplines, I kind of spanned the spectrum of what was available, from a music history class with Michael Grace, to a course in the Southern novel taught by George Butte, to a European history class taught by Professor Showalter. Needless to say, my favorite class was International Relations with Professor Sonderman, not least because that's where I met and started dating my husband, Tim, who will be speaking to you shortly. I was in no particular hurry to choose a major, except for one thing. During our sophomore year, as I'm sure many of you will remember, the college changed its graduation requirements to include that all students must write a senior thesis. If you declared a major before a certain date, no thesis was required, but if you declared after that date, you did have to write a thesis. Well, guess what happened? Probably half of our class rushed to declare a major before the deadline, including me. And though I was still somewhat directionless, I declared a political science major, and it turned out to be a great choice. The political science department at CC has always been extraordinary, with great professors, including Fred Sonderman and Bob Levy, Tim Fuller, Bob Lee, just to name a few. Tom Cronin, although he arrived shortly after I left. Following graduation, I actually put my major to good use, moving to Washington, D.C. to work in a senator's office. Shortly thereafter, I returned to Colorado to work in the public affairs department of an oil company. Meanwhile, Tim was having such a great experience in law school that, like many a poli-sci major before me, I decided to follow in his footsteps and go to law school, which was perhaps not the smartest move, since that meant that together we were in graduate school for 6 years straight. After law school and a brief stint in private practice, we moved back to D.C., and I landed in the solicitor's office at the Department of Interior, where one of my clients was the National Park Service. This was a great posting for me, given my interest in the West, and though I was only there a short time, it did leave me with an appreciation for the complexities of various land management issues. At this point, I took some time off to start a family, but when I was ready to look to the next chapter, I wasn't entirely sure that I wanted to return to the law. Remember, short attention span. Tim's legal career was going gangbusters, so I did have the opportunity of being able to experiment a little bit. Despite going out of my way to avoid writing a senior thesis, my favorite things to do were to read and write, and I began to wonder if I could turn that interest into more than just a hobby. I'd never lost my Midwesterner's appreciation for living in the West, and I knew that if I were to try to write something, I wanted it to be a Western story, whatever that might mean. I started checking books out of the library. You might remember the mid-90s when we still did research in libraries. I read hundreds of books, articles, files on Western history, searching for a story that begged to be told. Somewhere along the way, I ran across a book about Western outlaws. Most of them I'd never heard of. But one, Butch Cassidy, was a familiar name. I remembered seeing the famous movie about him, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, when I was a kid. I'm sure you all remember it. Paul Newman, Robert Redford, bicycles running through hayfields, raindrops and falling on heads. All of that had stuck in my memory. So I got to wondering, was the real Butch Cassidy like the character in the movie? A joke-cracking, happy-go-lucky guy who just happened to rob banks. Well, after tons of research, I determined that to some extent, he was like that. Because in spite of the fact that he stole more money than just about all other bank and train robbers combined, nobody, outside of maybe bank presidents and railroad executives, had a bad word to say about him. He never killed anybody, and reports are he looked after people who were kind of down on their luck, sort of like a Robin Hood figure. And then there's the mystery about how he died. Did he and Sundance die in South America, as the movie suggests? Well, there's some evidence that they didn't. Anyway, it seemed like there was a pretty good story there, and though much had been written about him in the nonfiction arena, there seemed to be an opening for a fictionalized account of his life. In other words, stick to the facts such as they were known, but then use my imagination to embroider the story. Well, once having picked a topic, the fun really began. Of course, I read all the material that I could find about him, but the best part was traveling, with family in tow, to all the scenes of his various exploits. Now, outlaws obviously do not want to hang out where there are lots of people. Butch and his gang preferred to live way off the grid, even by today's standards, in places like Hole in the Wall in Wyoming, Robber's Roost in Utah, and Brown's Park in Colorado. It was really fascinating to go camp in these remote areas, searching for the notch in the wall or the abandoned hideout cabin. After about 2 years of research and another year to write the book, I was lucky enough to find a publisher, and my book, Bandit Invincible, came out in 1999. While waiting for that first book to go through the publishing process, I wrote my second book, Lady Buckaroo, which is a novel about female rodeo stars from the early 20th century. And I followed that up with a sequel to the Butch Cassidy book, and then in 2005 published A Heart for Any Fate, which tells the story of my own family's migration story from Virginia to Kentucky to Missouri in the 1700s and 1800s. So I published 4 books in the space of 6 years. Since then, I've finished a couple of other manuscripts, which are still searching for a publishing home, and I remained active with Women Writing the West, which is an organization that supports those writing about the Women's West. But not surprisingly, my famously short attention span is wandering a bit, and these days I'm indulging some of my other interests in music and travel. And I guess I didn't mention I'm also a part-time aerobics instructor. As you can tell, my life hasn't taken a linear path. There have been stops and starts, detours, and even U-turns. But it took all of those combined experiences to lead me to having a modicum of success as a writer. And let me just say that CC did an excellent job of teaching me the research and study habits needed to undertake a major writing project. Maybe I should have written that senior thesis after all. Having a short attention span hasn't worked out too badly for me. Although, to be honest, I could just as easily make a case for the virtues of stick-to-itiveness. But today my message is that if, like me, you're a bit of a dabbler, perhaps you should view that as a feature, not a bug. Embrace your inner polymath. Thank you.
All right, Suzanne, I got to tell you that the only thing I've ever won was a T-shirt while flying on Western Pacific, and they had a quiz about a famous movie, and the first clue was Bolivia. And of course, who wouldn't know, because Jim Collins did such a good job organizing the movies that we saw at CC, and that was a big part of our experience as well. So Annie Petsonk, her long and winding road took her from the Harvard of the East to the true Harvard of the West, which is probably a little bit more fun and dynamic than the Harvard of the East, as you found it. And I got to tell you, I don't have that many memories of Annie at CC, but 10 years later, we wound up working in the Bush administration, and since then, everywhere I go in town, if I talk to somebody about the serious and urgent and necessary issue for us to deal with of climate change, I ask them, well, do you know Annie? And their eyes light up like, yes, she is the mover and shaker and driver of so much positive action on climate change. And I know she's going to talk about one issue that I dabbled in a little bit too, about the aviation component of this problem. And the great thing about Annie is she's driving solutions, and you're going to hear about them now.
So as Ed mentioned, I came to CC as a transfer student, and I'd been studying biology at Harvard and possibly pre-med, but kind of not sure. And around me there were, as far as the eye could see, everyone in biology was aggressively pre-med. And I was also interested in things like political theory and economics, but my roommates there who were taking those courses were absolutely pre-law. And I was kind of afraid to even dip my toe into those because law, and I'm a lawyer now. So when I happened to have fled Harvard for a year and was traveling around the West and got stuck in a snowstorm in this town called Colorado Springs, and met some students who said, hey, come stay at our college and see what it's like. I jumped at the chance and I loved it. And I thought, I'm going to school here and I'm going to try this interdisciplinary approach. So the first course I took, and it was very brave of me to do so as a biology major, I took George Drake's course in European history before 1850. And the first day of class was in Palmer Hall, and it was a gorgeous day, and the windows were open, and there was Professor Drake, and the entire field of European history laid out before me, and a hand reached over the windowsill of our classroom. And the classroom was on the second floor of Palmer Hall. And I looked at the hand, and it was followed by a head and then a person wearing climbing shoes who was free climbing the beautiful pink sandstone of Palmer Hall and came in through the window. And I thought, I've come to the right place. So that interdisciplinary approach that CC brings, which a number of other speakers have mentioned, has really stood me in tremendous stead over my career. And taking Bob Lee's course, where he humbly challenged us to solve the Middle East peace problems, really made an indelible mark for me because it just challenged us to think in ways that were so different. Of course, I loved my biology classes here, Southwest Ecosystems with Dick Beidelman, spending a month in the field with Jack Carter in field botany, and I was lucky enough to have John Lewis for geology, but only took that class my senior year. Had I taken it earlier, I think I would be doing something different now. But I also got to take an interdisciplinary course co-taught by Tim Fuller and George Butte, bringing together literature and political theory in amazing ways that taught me to question and think about how we as humans construct the systems of governance, the systems of policy. How do we respond to actual decisions that we need to make? And my biology background led me into a chance encounter with my Colorado College roommates one summer when we, instead of going on our annual summer hiking tour in the Southwest in some of those great ecosystems where Butch Cassidy hung out, one of our classmates decided instead of going on that hiking trip, she would get married. And the others said, we're really going to show her. We'll go someplace that she really wished she had gone. And the others came up with the idea, Linda Wheel and Peg Millett came up with the idea of going on a safari in Africa. I didn't want to go. I loved biology, but plants, I can identify. You can sit around and look at them, but I have a hard time spotting animals in the field. And so I didn't want to do it, but my peers pressured me, and so I went. And I loved it. And I decided to quit my, by then, law firm job in the East Coast, in Denver, and go move to East Africa. And I thought maybe with my biology education from CC, I could get a job teaching high school biology out in the field somewhere. But I couldn't do that because I wasn't a qualified teacher, and the only job I could get was working in the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, which was based in Nairobi, and was at that time beginning to look at the law, science, and policy of global warming. So that was in the late 1980s, and that was where I first learned that, everybody take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. And exhale. Okay, what we breathe in? Oxygen. What we exhale? Carbon dioxide. How long does the carbon dioxide that we exhaled stay in the atmosphere? A week, 2 weeks, a month, 100 years. 100 years. So when we as societies breathe in the energy from burning fossil fuel, and we exhale as societies that carbon dioxide out the tailpipe of the car or the smokestack of the power plant or the back of the aircraft engine, that carbon dioxide stays in the air for 100 years, warming the Earth. So today we exhale all the exhalations we had to get here from I took a plane and then I drove a car. All those exhalations stay in the atmosphere for 100 years, warming the Earth. And the ones that I will exhale tomorrow, taking the car back up to Denver, flying back to the East Coast, will stay in the atmosphere for 100 years, warming the Earth. So the concentrations of the carbon dioxide are piling up in the atmosphere faster than what absorbs them? Plants. Faster than the trees can absorb them, and faster than, I'll give you a hint, something else that absorbs them. Water, the oceans. Jane Lubchenco, many of you know her, the Lubchenco girls from Colorado College made tremendous impact in oceanography and ocean protection. The oceans also absorb carbon dioxide, but we're putting more up there faster than the oceans and the trees can absorb them. And so some people ask me about the science of climate change, and this is simply a chart of carbon dioxide concentrations shown in the orange, in the yellow, and temperatures shown in the orange. And it's very clear from the science, as much as those with agendas have tried to muddy the science, and I'm happy to take questions about how they've tried to do that and so on, the carbon dioxide levels and the temperature are rising in the planet. So CC challenged me to use my liberal arts education to make a difference. And I, like you, I had a child along the way. And so while I could have and have at times in my career worked on all the different components of our exhalations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere that come from residential and commercial, base load electricity, road transportation, and so on, I chose, after my kid was born, to focus on one small piece of things, which is aviation. And aviation, it's only 2% of the problem, but if it were a country, it would be a top 10 emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. A person flying round trip from New York to London, which I do and I'm going to do next month, generates about as much emissions as the average European heating their home for a whole year. So it takes a lot of energy to lift a big heavy aircraft with all of us in it up off the ground. And because when we sit in the aircraft, we need space around us to breathe, the aircraft is not transporting our weight as efficiently as if it were a cargo aircraft. The cargo you can stack in, doesn't need to breathe. And so passenger aircraft, by definition, and we have people who are much more expert than I here on passenger aircraft, and I welcome your questions and your contributions. They emit and are not very efficient means of transportation, but it's also an incredible technology-rich industry. The largest exporter of anything in dollar terms from the United States is Boeing. The largest exporter from Europe is Airbus. Airplanes cost a lot of money, and it's incredible technology to put them together. The engineering, the amount of time, I mean, you can tell me, Jim, how long does it take to design an engine and test it and then get it on an aircraft, put it into production? 15 or 20 years. So the technologies that many of our classmates decided to develop when they graduated from CC and began experimenting in the technology field, those are flying today, and they're going to continue flying, because once you have an aircraft, it's not like your car, you don't trade it in after X number of years, you fly it for a long time. So there's a technology lock-in in this field, while it is very technology rich. And the other thing that got me interested in aviation was it's governed by international standards. Who's flown internationally recently? Where did you go?
Tokyo.
Tokyo. Who else?
Bangkok.
Bangkok. Who else? Kenya. All right. Anybody else? Poland. So where'd you go?
Ireland.
Ireland. In each of those places you went, I'm not going to ask you because you probably have a very long list. In each of those places that you went, when you got on the aircraft, you didn't worry about whether the strength of the bolt that holds the engine onto the wing was governed by Polish law or Irish law or Kenyan law. You accepted that there is an international standard that says how strong that bolt has to be to hold the engine onto the wing, and everybody flies it. And that's pretty amazing. That international standard is set by a UN agency that few people have heard of. It's called the International Civil Aviation Organization, and it was started in 1944. Now this is where I get to mix the disciplines, right? So we've gone from the science of climate change, the technology of it, now we're getting to the political theory of it. These guys got together in 1944. What was going on in 1944, history majors only? Okay, so we know what was going on in 1944, and they sat down together in Canada, and they said aircraft are this technology that's developed amazingly during the war as instruments of war. Airplanes have been instruments of war, but we think they can be instruments of peace. We think they can be instruments of exchange among nations, cultural exchange, people exchange, idea exchange. Going back to what Bob Lee challenged me to think about in the class where you said, how can you bring people from different cultures and values in the Middle East together? Well, one way you bring them together and bring people of different cultures is to fly. And so they established something called the Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation to promote cooperation and create and preserve friendship and understanding among the nations and peoples of the world. In wartime, they did this. Amazing foresight. And this treaty, and since I'm now a lawyer and I'm an international lawyer, I like treaties. This treaty is very unusual. Most treaties, if you're going to change them, you have to amend them and you go through a long process. But they said, we want this industry to develop very fast as soon as there is peace. And we ask the sovereign nations who sign on to this treaty to surrender some sovereignty to their representatives in the treaty body and allow them to develop standards for aircraft without amending the treaty. They develop the standard and it becomes law. And this body has developed some 10,000 international standards, and I am now working with it to develop standards for the pollution that comes out of airplanes and to cap the amount of pollution that sorry, let me just stick with this. The amount of pollution that comes out of planes. We've gotten 193 nations to agree to limit the carbon pollution from every one of those international flights that you took The limits start to take effect in 2021. They run through 2035. And starting in 2021, all flights, all international flights between nations that choose to participate, because after all, they're sovereigns, they decide if they want to participate, will have to be capped at 2020 levels, and if they emit more than that, the airlines will have to buy carbon offsets or purchase alternative fuels that reduce emissions. I'm now more time than I wanted to be devoting, than I was allowed to devote, and Ed hasn't brought out the cane yet, so I will leave the part about offsets and fuels for your questions. But I will say, I showed you pictures of men who originated ICAO. Does anybody know who this woman is? It's a trick question. She's the highest ranking woman in the aviation industry, in the industry side. She's the CEO of Air France. Does anyone know who this woman is? Amazing. You didn't know who she was, but everybody knows who she is. All right. And she's in Denver today leading a climate march. And airlines are really scared of her. They are scared that her decision not to fly to New York to the climate summit, to take a boat instead, has captured the imagination of the airline's future clients. And so her challenge to this industry is, let's go. Let's find newer, cleaner ways of flying, new technologies, so that you and your kids and their kids can fly without damaging the climate. Thanks.
And part of the solution lies in the American West, because the plants they're looking at for jet fuel, like chamomile, grown here, and not only civil aviation, but the military has gotten involved with looking at green fuels. So this is an incredible story that Annie's helped to develop. So moving on to our next speaker, I will tell a personal story about our freshman dorm, Slocum 1 North. Several of our esteemed members are here. Steve Winship, Jim Collins, Mike Hunt, Terry Swenson, myself, and Sharon, were you on our sister wing? Oh, Julie was. Okay, Julie was on our sister wing. So, and what was you were 2 West, Julie?
No, we were in 3 North.
3 North, okay. So between the two of our organizations, oh, who's there? I'm sorry. Oh, Russ Reidinger. Hi, how are you? I didn't see you there. But between the two, between us and our sister wings, we are the claimants and proud holders of the title of winners of the Freshman Olympics in 1975. And Terry Swenson, he really was not part of that. He doesn't claim the glory because he was off helping our football team to our last Division III playoff. So, but he was my roommate later, and I grew to love his open mind about literature and just finding great people like Flannery O'Connor and telling us all about them. And he is part of a short line of people, 3 people really. I'm sure you'll talk about who've maintained the continuity of our admissions process, but within a process of great change, and that's an incredible story. And Terry will tell it to us now.
Thank you, Ed. First of all, Susie, reading and writing, I hear you. I mean, that's what I tell people I learned to read at CC. More on that later. And Annie, I tell, geology, I had the same experience. Professor Fisher, I think was his name, and the first thing he said in the first day of class was, if for no other reason, you will enjoy this class, because if you learn geology, you will always be curious about where you are, where you travel, what you see, and have maybe some small ability to piece together what you're seeing. And so and that's true for me. This afternoon, I'm going to start with a quick history of CC admissions over the last 57 years. In my next 20 minutes, I will share a few observations, and then I will leave you with some questions. By the way, as I figure out the technology here, I invited Dick Wood to be here with us today, and I did not know if he was considering it, but I got an email from him this morning saying it's frustrating to get older and I won't be able to be with you, but he was considering it, and so I send his greetings to you all. I'm starting where we all started. This Catalyst article in the spring of '75 features Dick, who admitted us to the college, and covers a few facts about our fall entering class. By the way, some in our class transferred, as we've learned from Annie, and of course many in our class started as summer starts. But this is a kind of a preview of the fall class in the fall of, or that was in the spring of '75. So a few facts from our class. 40% of the fall class were from Colorado, 14 of which were Betcher scholars, and I think a third of the Betcher scholars lived on our freshman wing. I'm not sure, but it seemed packed. There were 2,300 applicants, 2,500 applicants. 39% of us were offered admission, and that was certainly selective in the larger history of CC, as we will see. No longer that is no longer where we are today. And 25% of the class received need-based financial aid. Now, keep in mind, I thought when I saw that, I thought that seems like a small number, but then as I reflected on it, the cost of Colorado College at that time was really within reach of middle-income families. My own family being an example, we happened to have had a pretty good couple of wheat harvests the years before I applied to CC, and my folks were able to afford to send me for the first couple of years. I sold my car for one of those years, but in perspective, the price of wheat at that time was $5 a bushel. It's now $3.50. So CC would not have been in reach for our family. Now, again, we'll talk more about this in a bit. I couldn't find test scores from that year. I really did look, by the way. This was interesting. It was hard to find kind of the test scores for our class. It appears that a third of us, or I should say you, ranked in the top 5% of our high school classes. One last significant fact, only 6% of our class were students of color. One of those, and I would say that I think it's fairly clear just talking to Dick and looking at the history that the college's efforts to diversify were pretty nascent at that time. It was actually in those years in the early 70s that the college officially adopted a policy of admitting 50% men and women. Prior to that, the policy was 60% women in the entering class. Hey, there's Daddy. By the way, one of those students of color in our freshman class was Don Torres, who was later hired as the first person in the admission office to attempt to increase student diversity. Now let me look backwards a bit, not quite as far back as this picture might suggest. I love this picture, though. It's a reminder that the college is part of the High Plains. The era of selective admissions at CC had really only begun a few years before we applied. When Dick Wood became director of admission in the summer of 1962, the class was not yet full. And he spent the rest of the summer trying to fill spots right up until the day that students arrived. That is not to say, and I want to make this clear, in part anticipating a sort of broader representation of classes, but I do want to say that it is not to say that the college did not attract remarkable students in that year, 1962, or in any year we might consider. Nonetheless, it is a fact that a decade after Dick started, the admission picture changed suddenly and dramatically. During the 1969-70 academic year, applications for the new class doubled. And suddenly Dick and his small admission crew, were turning away students like never before. I always sort of looked at this as sort of the glory days of the beginning of the, as I was involved with him, the glory days of the beginning of the, the sort of selective era. And he said it was just really very difficult and confusing to people. But nonetheless, the college was in great demand. I do want to pause here and say, and this is something we can talk about later if there's interest, but selectivity is an imperfect and overused statistic, whether we're talking about the quality of enrolling students or the education they receive. It is, of course, a huge factor in the current situation at CC. Why the increased interest in CC at that time? Certainly the block plan must have been part of it, but there were other things going on. CC had, in previous years, actually been a founding member of the Common Application. Dick and like 7 other admission deans, including the admission dean from Harvard, started the Common Application. And it put CC sort of on the national radar for, among other people, college admission counselors. So certainly the block plan was a factor there. Now let me leap forward to the current state of admissions. It is a remarkable story. Over the decades, the last 2 decades in particular, applications have almost tripled, and the makeup of the student body has changed in some significant ways. Demographically, the current class and student body is far more diverse, with 27% of students of color and 9% of the new class coming from outside of the U.S., 18 countries represented in the new class alone. Roughly 35% of the students received need-based financial aid, with the average award being $52,000 against a total cost of roughly $75,000. On the other hand, Colorado students represent 15% of the new class. Incidentally, one of Dick Wood's first charges as he started in 1962 was to enroll more students from Colorado. Finally, as you can see, competition for a place at CC is fierce, not to mention the workload of the admission staff. The academic profile of the new class is very strong. These students are well prepared and they are really smart. Although he couldn't be here today, I did want to just mention briefly Mark Hatch, Vice President for Enrollment. Mark and I have had a good relationship over the years. He's been very helpful in helping me think about this presentation. They have really done a remarkable job. CC is thriving in a highly competitive environment, one in which good schools, very good schools, peer institutions are really struggling for their survival. So, we kind of might look at some things about CC and wish that things weren't changing. Well, things are changing, and CC is doing very well, as I said, in a very competitive environment. Finally, I want to discuss the question that was the original premise, and I'll move off the stats of our talk. Would any of us get into CC today? The more I have thought about that and talked to others about this question, I realize it's not really the question for us today. When you consider the possible answers, yes, maybe, or no way, Two of those three answers are not a particularly good way to begin our reunion weekend. Sure, it might be interesting to speculate on how our scores then compare to scores today, given recentering and test prep courses, or how we might today be more astute about packaging ourselves in the admission process. But the reality is we did get in. And based on the random sample of the members of the class on the panel today, the admission committee clearly knew what they were doing. So I have a different question for you to consider and perhaps discuss with one another when conversation lulls, or even as you get conversation started over the weekend. What is your story of discovering, applying to, and choosing CC? I had a very interesting process in preparing for this talk. I actually had prepared a poll to send around to a lot of my classmates, and it was really, here are the statistics. Would you get in? Would you want to come? Could you afford it? I sent it to Tim Zarlingo and Ed Goldstein, and I did not hear back. And I thought, okay, I think I'm asking the wrong question. I sent a different question. What is your story about coming to CC? And I heard back. And then I heard from Annie and from others, and it really is a wonderful reminder that we are not statistics, nor is the college a set of statistics. And so I encourage you to share your stories. Finally, I find that reflecting on our beginning leads to thoughts about our continuing, about what our CC education has meant to us. Now, we've heard much about that today, and it's been wonderful. I will say just personally that as happy as I was to get that letter of admission from Mr. Wood, whom I called that for many, many years after I started working at CC, as happy as I was to get that letter of admission, I had no idea what a life-changing experience I would have at CC. I hope you feel the same way, and I hope you have a wonderful reunion weekend. Thank you.
Before Tim gets up, a couple thoughts. Terry's story about how we grew to recognize that we needed a more diverse student body came home to me. I guess it was a summer ago on summer vacation. My close friend, who was the best man at our wedding, who was also Melanie's roommate at her undergrad school, Brandeis, called me up out of the blue and said, "Have you seen the movie Black Klansman?" I said, "No, why?" He said, "Well, the Colorado College Black Student Union is recognized in the movie," and it really compelled me to find out what this story was all about. And how many of you have seen the movie? Oh, the vast majority. Well, Spike Lee took a little liberty in history and made that movie take place in 1972. In reality, the Ron Stallworth becoming the first black police officer in Colorado Springs happened while we were students, and the David Duke March that the film refers to was protested peacefully and effectively by a combination of members of the CC Black Student Union, the Hispanic La Mecha group, and faculty members. And one of our ideas for this Tiger Talks was to have somebody tell that story. Unfortunately, we didn't find the right person, but it is remarkable that even then, although our numbers were not great in terms of the diversity of the student body, that we have that as part of our legacy, that they were leaders in that regard. One other thought, too, that also in our class, we miss Carol Peterson, who was your longtime aide and friend and colleague on the admissions committee, and she did such a great job. Miss her smiling face. Well, Tim Tymkovich had many roads to his path to be a leading jurist in our country, and also in reading over a major figure in international legal jurisprudence and the interchange we have with the other countries. And I'm sure that he will tell you that the defining moment of his learning to write incisive rulings from the bench was his being the sports editor of the Catalyst, and the great work he did put in on that. He was a tremendous editor-in-chief. And one other thing I was going to mention about Tim is that when we were discussing the dress code for this event, he deferred on wearing his judicial robes, and he comes to us as he is, and continues to be our friend, and we'd love to hear about how the block plan influenced your legal career.
Thank you, Ed. It's wonderful to be on campus again. It really looks a lot nicer than when we went here. So the increase in tuition that I paid for my son, class of 2010, went to some good improvements here. And it's just great to listen to my friends and colleagues about the amazing things that you've done in your careers. My carbon footprint's been pretty bad recently, sorry. Politics, no way. I've got a lifetime appointment doing something else. Thank God. Sue writes great books, and it's really fun to see the amazing things that all of you have done. I'm going to comment on three aspects of the Colorado experience as I see it. First, I'm going to mention the relationships it created and fostered, and we've heard some of that already. Then I'd like to discuss why I was persuaded by the value of a liberal arts education, how CC furthered that education, and how my CC years informed my professional career, first as a law clerk, as a lawyer, and then as a federal judge for the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver. Then I'll finish with what I see as some concerns about the future of a liberal arts education and the CC experience. Well, first, the relationships. You've already heard many of those. The most important one, of course, is sitting in the front row next to me. Sue didn't mention this, but we actually met in freshman year, Block 2, Intro to Chemistry. But we didn't quite have the chemistry yet. It took till sophomore year international relations under the great Fred Sonderman for it finally to kick in. We were married at Shove Chapel on campus, had our reception up at the Grand Ballroom at the Broadmoor Hotel. And I still host a lot of conferences at the Broadmoor, and every time I walk by the ballroom, I remember a great night celebration we had there. Mike Ibarra, Mike Hunt, Tracy, many others were there that were CC grads. That's been 40 years ago. Sue tells me that our 40th anniversary is coming up, and she says that the substance for that one is diamonds. And diamonds every year thereafter, right, Sue? In addition to my wife, of course, we have lifelong friends that are here, and Ed and Mike and Tracy, Kathy McCall, Dave Morrison, Dave and Terry Clark, Terry Lydon, so many people that whose friendships develop here that I still see on a very, very regular basis. Others that I see professionally, Tom Blickensderfer was a member of the Colorado legislature when I was the Solicitor General for the state of Colorado, and I had to go lobby this guy for my budget in the Attorney General's office, which was he was a tough sell on that. But in addition to the personal relationships, the intellectual and academic relationships formed at CC are of equal value. After freshman chemistry, like many of you that took that, I knew med school was not in my future, so I turned to public policy and the law. I love my pursuit of a degree in political science here, and I thought that would be the best advancement to my planned legal career. I had the good fortune to have many great professors here in the political science department. My faculty advisor, Bob Levy, was one of the leading poli-sci professors at the time, and he brought to the classroom the latest scholarship and active participation in Colorado politics, and a just amazing understanding of party politics, party politics. We stayed in touch over the years, and I even hired Professor Levy to be an expert witness for me in the 2000 cycle congressional redistricting case in the state of Colorado. So I not only made a friend and a professor, but I got a future expert witness, and I think that was a formative experience for Professor Levy. Bob Lee, of course, taught me about the Middle East crisis. The Suez crisis is what we study primarily. We might have been in the same class. It's strange to say, but not a whole lot's changed in the 40 years, right? I took Professor Tom Cronin's very first class on the American presidency my second semester senior year, and Professor Cronin and I developed a personal and professional relationship over the years. In fact, last year I came back to campus and I was a guest speaker at his last American presidency class before he retired. So in a sense, both Professor Cronin and I are bookends on the CC experience. I just finished his book on politics and the novel, and I highly commend it to you. It's a really interesting book about American novels and ties it to our political culture. Professor Cronin came up to our couples reading group in Denver. We were reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that's one of the stories in his book, and he made a wonderful presentation to our group. That group has 3 CC grads in it, so the education of the college continues. And finally, Professor Tim Fuller was my political theory professor and is one of the country's leading scholars on the great philosopher Michael Oakeshott. Much of the work we did in those poli-sci classes is still relevant to my day job as a federal judge. The philosophical foundations of the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are important interpretive guides for judges and lawyers trying to understand and implement the separation of powers, federalism, and the rule of law. Thanks to those professors, and especially those that have stayed in touch over the years to furthering my education in that regard. And full confession, I used the essence of one of Oakeshott's books from Professor Fuller's class in an opinion that I wrote not too long ago. The book was called Rationalism and Politics. Go read it. Finally, those personal and intellectual relationships with CC have been supplemented by family relationships with the college. My son Michael went here. My 2 nephews also attended Colorado College. I'd like next to comment on CC and the value of a liberal arts education to me as a federal judge. When I applied to CC, the idea of a small liberal arts college appealed to me. The CC of the time talked about the value of critical and independent thinking, exposure to a range of ideas and views, and robust debate among students and faculty. As Professor Glenn Brooks put it around the time of my enrollment, quote, "A student with a broader base in the liberal arts, even though he may initially lack some of the technical expertise of his counterpart in the technical schools, is encouraged to seek connections between facts, ideas, and concepts, to express himself clearly in writing and speaking, to think critically about his own field of knowledge as well as the fields of others, and to acquire, in Plato's phrase, a sense of the whole." And wasn't that really reflected in the talks that you've heard so far this afternoon? And I'd like to think that those objectives were met with me. The CC Political Science Department exposed majors to both sides of the political and partisan debates of the day. Professor Levy was a Republican. Professor Cronin was a Democrat. Party affiliation never made a bit of difference. We read Marx's The Communist Manifesto and Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, and much in between. Theories of government and ordered liberty don't go out of style, and many of the debates from my CC days are still with us every day in Washington, D.C., or on the presidential campaign trail. In fact, I got an email from Diana DeGette this morning. She's our congressman in Denver. She was this class of 79 poli-sci grad. She sends her regret because she's with a bipartisan group in Africa touring a number of the fledgling democracies in that continent. And the chance to continue to interact with Congressman direct. See, instead of Tom Blickensderfer having my budget, now I've got Diana DeGette to worry about for my budget. But it helps to have those jam sessions that we had at Colorado College. In addition to what I learned, I'm glad to see that the block plan has endured. I tell people the block plan is like life. As a student, we immerse ourselves in a single course of related materials. As a lawyer and judge, I find my life still ordered that way. Am I writing a brief or preparing for trial? It's a lot like the block plan. Intensive work for around 3 weeks and then off to the next project. Writing an opinion or preparing for oral argument now, much the same process. And because judges are not specialists on the 10th Circuit, nearly every case requires me to learn a new area of law or thinking about applying a different set of facts to familiar legal principles. We use foundations of precedent to decide cases, just like the critical thinking of a liberal education relies on previous concepts and values. So CC's educational experience these many decades seem to be a success and a guide to professional success. I suspect that you non-lawyers have much the same experience in your professions. Finally, I'd like to comment on looking forward to the next 40 years and a future class reunion. I'm an optimist, and optimism is generally warranted. Since we graduated from CC, the world has transformed itself. International poverty is the lowest it's been in the history of the world. Disease is down. Life expectancy is up. The Cold War ended without a major military conflict. Technology has created incredible opportunities. The 20th century was a century of conflict, but taught us many lessons for this one. Karl Marx didn't fare so well in retrospect. Milton Friedman is still holding up pretty well. But for some reasons, many people are depressed and pessimistic. Whether it's domestic politics or global warming, many of us think we are in an existential crisis. But I don't see it. There are many dark clouds out there, but I think they are manageable, and people like Annie Petsonk are trying to solve them. From my perch as a federal judge, I think I work in an institution that's the envy of the world. As Ed mentioned, I've had the opportunity to do many international outreach programs. I'm going to the country of Ukraine in 3 weeks to train Ukrainian judges on leadership and judicial independence. Those Ukrainian judges are eager to adopt our model and help that country beat back corruption and join the Western European countries as a free and equal partner. So I'm optimistic about that. But perhaps a dark cloud hovers over higher education and the notion of a liberal arts education. The CC ethos of 1979 concerning free and open education are questioned by many. Many in higher education think our institutions and economy need dramatic transformation, and some issues are not really open for debate and discussion. A recent book by the dean of the Yale Law School called The Assault on Higher Excellence by Anthony Kronman explores these risks in greater detail, and I commend it to you if you're interested. The college, Colorado College, is free to choose its values and policy preferences however it wishes. My sense is that in the classroom, students are still exposed to a wide range of ideas and approaches. That was my experience in Tom Cronin's class that I attended last year. So I hope CC continues to foster a traditional liberal arts education in the years ahead. It should be an institution open to all viewpoints and explore every philosophy. That helps us understand and appreciate the American Democratic Republic, something I deal with every day as a judge. The value of a CC education was to appreciate how special our American experiment is by looking around the world and the world's history. In sum, it seems that the CC mission is still very much necessary in training future leaders and engaged citizens. So good luck to the class of 2020, if any are here, and the future of the Colorado College experience. For us on the panel, let's do it again in 2059 for our 80th reunion. Thank you.
Great. I had one question, but I'm going to save it for the end because I know other people have questions. So the floor is open. Michael.
For Terry, what prompted the college to make reporting of standardized scores optional? And follow-up, are there historical comparisons to be made that you might anticipate that decision to result?
I don't know the answer to the first question. What I can say is that it is part of a larger trend. Class rank is almost a disappearing statistic. So I think that there's a pressure away from exclusionary or arbitrary, and I think there's some perception that test scores are able to be manipulated and somewhat arbitrary. But I haven't talked to Mark about that in particular. As to your second question, I think that there already is as a result of that, it looks like there's an increase in applications again this year. So Mark thinks that both the Colorado Pledge, which I didn't mention and should have, one of the things that we saw it was seen as a big decrease in Colorado representation. I alluded to a decrease in what I would call middle income, family participation at CC. The Colorado Pledge, if you haven't had a chance to learn about that, is really a remarkable effort towards addressing both of those issues. So it's a pledge on the college's part for the entering class that students in certain income bands, Colorado students whose families are in certain income bands, will get significant support financially. So that's not an answer to your question. But that along with the test optional seem to have already bumped applications again for the coming year. So I think they're probably looking at over 10,000 applications to get through. The other thing that's fascinating about the current admission picture is that a huge chunk of the class now gets filled early. The admission rate for the regular cycle applicants is 4%.
Oh my gosh.
So, the class is getting filled, and it's getting filled early.
Other questions? Annie?
Also a question for you. How's the transfer rate in and out?
I didn't get those stats.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question for Annie. So I've already Googled how much and how long it takes to get from the United States to Europe, and that's out, because that's like 2 weeks just to get there. But on your pie chart, the big chunk was electricity over here, and then a bad chunk in the hard to get rid of was also electricity. And so I'm just wondering how electric cars relate to carbon, dioxide production, and because it seems like, okay, I'm probably going to fly to Europe. So that's out. But what about this chunk? What can we do, this electricity thing?
So this is a great question. Anybody here ever driven a Tesla? What do you think of it?
Great car. And if anybody knew how good it was, that's all they'd sell. Until the Ford truck comes out.
So I mentioned that I chose to work on aviation because it's got this international treaty stuff, so it's kind of easy to get at, and cars don't have that. But right now there's this raging debate between the entire aviation industry, which says we don't have anything other than liquid fuel to bring a big aircraft up into the air, and electric aircraft, which are under development right here in Colorado, and hybrid electrics are under development. And do you want to comment on that? Electric? Okay, so there's a lot of interest in those. They may change the way people fly because it's really hard to build an electric aircraft that'll hold more than about 10 to 20 passengers. And so instead of the enormous infrastructure that we have in the hub and spoke model with Denver International Airport being this big hub and everybody going to Denver if they're going to fly internationally or something like that, we're going to see, some people think we may see, small airports handling electric aircraft for short hops, and those will be called the hoppers, and they'll be specially used in Europe where the cities are closer and where the airspace is very dense. But there's this raging debate because the aviation industry says we need the limited amount of fossil fuel that the global atmosphere can allow us to exhale, to burn and exhale. Cars don't need that because you can run an electric car. Tesla's a delightful car to drive. And if you own a Tesla and you use this, which I do not, but believe me, I'm talking to my husband about it because I went for a ride in one a couple weeks ago. And the owner showed me on the information screen in the car, there's a map showing you the nearest charging center, both the overnight charging center and the rapid charging center where you can recharge your car, like go have some coffee and write part of a brief and then be back on the road. And they're everywhere around the country. People want to have these charging stations. So I was recently on a panel with the head of sustainability for VW. Now, VW is a company that's been through, let's say, a cathartic experience. They, as coming out of that cathartic experience, have appointed an external sustainability advisory board, and the board of directors of VW has taken the decision that they are going to be out of the internal combustion engine business by 2040. There's no room in the atmosphere for them. The last internal combustion engine VWs will roll off the assembly line in 2040, and they'll have a life of 10 years, and they'll be done. They're shifting entirely to electrics, and to power those electrics, they are investing in large-scale, listen Coloradans, wind and solar, so that when those cars are powered, when you plug your Tesla in to the charging center, you're not actually increasing the demand for fossil fuel. Now the infrastructure implications of that are enormous, because right now our lights here in this room are on the grid, and we are demanding, and the college is demanding, renewable energy to power the college. Pretty soon, the car fleet of Colorado Springs is going to become another demandor for that electricity. And so either the price of solar and renewables is going to go up, or there's going to be a whole lot more investment in those. And so these enormous investment decisions, and Mike, this goes to exactly the sustainability, broad social, economic, and environmental sustainability of communities that you're, with your investment background, really thinking deeply about. That is all on the table right now. So how can we each become more responsible? Your home should be powered by renewable electricity. If you live in a place where there's choice, you can get that choice. You know about that, yeah? So if there's no choice, take that dive into local politics to get that choice, to make it happen. Your car can be hybrid, can be all electric. That's the future. That's where it's got to go. And for your travel, so I travel internationally. The aviation people like to have their meetings, like in the past 2-3 years, I've been to United Arab Emirates, Montreal, often Singapore twice. They like to fly. It's their business, so they have their meetings all around the world. So what do? I can choose to buy carbon offsets, and you may have experimented with some of that. My organization's developing a guide for consumers. Where's the quality in the carbon offset? How can I be sure that this carbon offset I just bought isn't also being claimed by the country where it's located or the state where it's located? And if I really want my carbon offset to have some benefit, I've got to sort that out. That's taking us into areas of property law, property in emission reductions. Who's going to regulate that market? I emailed this morning with Mary Jo White. She's the former Securities Exchange Commissioner of the United States, because I need advice on how to rate the quality of carbon offsets. What can we learn from that 2008 financial crisis, and how badly the rating agencies, never mind, I won't go into that. All of that learning we're going to have to bring to bear from all those different disciplines onto the climate challenge, and we're going to have to bring the social sciences too, because how people make decisions, how they actually think about, am I willing to pay a tax? Would I rather offset? Where am I going to get my fuel from? Can I get my fuel in a way that helps maybe raise the price of wheat and give farmers a better income? That's vital to a political solution to this in the United States. So we have to think about it all across our CC disciplines. Whatever you studied or wherever your interest is, you can bring it to bear on this question.
More questions? I have a question for Annie. Annie, do you have a video?
Oh, yes, I do.
Okay.
Look at it go. Still feels like magic, doesn't it? Do you remember your first flight? We do. Even though it was 100 years ago. Going here, and ooh yeah, even here. People have really gotten the hang of it. It's changed our world forever. But 100 years of aviation comes with great responsibility. Because you want our children to get to know this beautiful world too, right? That's why we're working night and day to improve flying for the next 100 years. But we can only make it possible together. That's why we want to ask you something. To fly more responsibly, do you always have to meet face to face? Could you take the train instead? Could you contribute by compensating your CO2 emissions or packing light? We, the first commercial airline in the world, today kindly invite you, all travelers in the aviation industry, to join forces. To join us in making the world aware of our shared responsibility. We all have to fly every now and then. But next time, think about flying responsibly.
It's remarkable to me. Now we need to take it off here. So, okay. It's remarkable to me that a for-profit airline, KLM, is communicating to you, the customer, to think twice before you buy its product. That's the kind of transformation that our world is embarking on now.
All right. So to end things up, I'm going to start off. We'll just go down the row. One of the CC's really interesting innovations is their new idea hub, where they're sponsoring students who have big ideas. We've heard about some really interesting ideas that our panelists pursued. I want to ask them, looking forward, like Mike did, and Tim, what's the big idea you want to pursue or you want to see happen in the next 20, 30 years that you've been involved in? Start with Terry.
I'm going to get my colonoscopy.
Okay, how do I follow that?
That's good.
Do you want to start the note? I'll take it back out.
Okay. I would say rebuild trust among citizens and communities, big, small, nationally, internationally. Trust.
As I said, I'd like to foster a free and independent judiciary in those many countries around the world that have not been as lucky as the United States to have a strong third branch of government.
I'm preaching to the choir on this, I'm sure, but it's so important that we read and write and that we do that every single day with our children, so grandchildren too.
The bottom line of the work that we do ultimately is to teach the next generation how to learn from the mistakes we made. So I would suggest try and teach somebody something that otherwise will disappear.
For me, it's transparency. In my work, I need to deal with the fact that the country with, for example, just in the case of flying, the country with the greatest number of revenue ton kilometers, international revenue ton kilometers, that is international money-making flights internationally, is China. And the transparency challenges, and this goes to your point about independent judiciary too, Tim, I think are ones that our CC education and CC values need to be brought to bear on.
Susan?
One thing I would love to see is equity, development of equity in the availability, quality, and advocacy of medicine for all classes of people. We come from a very educated and, as a result, privileged group. And when you see the quality of care that some of our communities receive, it's heartbreaking. And I'd like to see that playground leveled a bit.
Terry?
First of all, I did not mean to make light of your presentation because I really probably will be calling you. Not for that, but just there's a lot there. I was talking to, so my challenge to myself first and then to all of us is, you know, apart from the sort of kind of difficult realities of access to a place like Colorado College, we have the incredible gift of appreciating the love of learning and of interdisciplinary learning and curiosity. And I'm reminded of a conversation with Carol Neal in which she talked about a new initiative at the college in which she and others are teaching at a local juvenile correction facility and bringing a gift, the gift of curiosity and hope and intellectual stimulation to people who not only can't get into CC, but really don't have any access to quality education at all. So I think all of us can share, and Mike, I think, alluded to this, but all of us can share, whether it's with our grandchildren or in an outreach of that kind, encourage people to be learners and to use their minds.
Thanks, Terry. Well, I think if you've seen, 44 years ago, some very incredible people came to this campus and made a commitment to what makes CC great, and they're continuing it on and have lived that commitment through their lives well lived by doing good for others. I think that's a great signature of our class, and I'm so proud of all of you. Thank you all for participating today. This is a great way to start off homecoming weekend. Thanks a lot.